We are going to go ahead and get started. I am recording this for our colleagues who can't be here today. So good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. If you don't know me, I'm Aaron Rester. I'm the Assistant VP for Web Development at Roosevelt. And today we're hosting a webinar about accessible media with Canopy Studios. Because there's a lot of things that can be done during the design and the build of a website to make it more accessible. But we thought that the topic of making media in general was more accessible, was a topic on which we could all use a refresher. So also with me on the call are Allison Manley, the Director of Marketing at Canopy Studios, and AmyJune Hineline, Canopy's Community Ambassador. And I will turn it over to AmyJune to take it from here.
Okay, can folks hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to talk about accessible media, like Aaron said. And accessible media is important because it supports all of our senses. And please note, because we're virtual, that during the webinar, if you have questions, feel free to ask the questions in the sidebar chat of Zoom as we go, and then we'll keep them in the queue for a Q&A at the end of the webinar. And before we start, I know some people kind of give some hate on Google Slides and Google Suite, but one thing I really appreciate about Google Slides is this captioning option. If you click on this at the beginning of the presentation, you'll see that Google will live caption as we go. They aren't perfect and they aren't ideal, but if you don't have anything, like say you're giving a virtual conference or meetup and you have the need for this, they're better than nothing. But I'm going to turn them off because they're a little bit distracting. But I just wanted to point those out. At the end, Zoom will caption videos and do transcripts automatically. So Zoom is a good resource for helping your media become accessible as you go. Canopy, we love helping the community. Please reach out to the team with any questions and needs. And we really, really enjoy accessible websites. So if you'd like to have Canopy help audit your site for accessibility, and that sounds interesting, you can email Tanya at hello@canopy.com. And a little bit about myself. My name is AmyJune. I go by the pronouns she and her. I'm the open source community ambassador at Canopy Studios. I'm relatively new to tech in the last 5 years or so. I'm a hospice nurse by trade. And when I got into tech and I found out that folks could make their websites and media accessible and they didn't, it was a weird concept for me. So I sort of found the niche of accessibility as soon as I came into the tech market. I help organize and market an online virtual meetup called Ally Talks. That's A11Y Talks, where we have speakers and guests discuss all things accessibility, because I believe that all information should be accessible to everyone. And a little bit about Canopy. We design, build, and support websites for clients who want to make a positive impact. And of course, we make all of our projects as accessible as possible. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about what accessibility is, and we're going to go through some terms and definitions, and I'm going to include some of the standards and guidelines that we all hear about, some acronyms that we might not be familiar with. I'm going to talk about what assistive technology is, and then I'll go into the media, including images, slideshows, videos, media players, social media. And then if we have time at the end, I'm going to do a quick demo on testing some free tools. How do we embrace accessibility? First, we have to understand what it means. So in the context I'm going to talk about today, it's about producing rich and engaging media that's accessible to everybody. And this is one of my favorite quotes ever. Temple Grandin is professor at Colorado State University, and she specializes in animal science. She's a consultant to the livestock industry on animal behavior. but she's also an autism spokesperson. She's actually one of the first individuals, autistic individuals, to publicly share insights about her experience. And she says, "I'm different, not less." And really that means that differences can't be quantified. Why do we design for accessibility? Well, we want to include a wider consumer base for our content. We don't want to exclude people from using our products and services and our websites. So accessibility is essential for developers and organizations that really want to create those high quality websites and the corresponding web tools and not exclude people from using their services. And according to the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, 26% of people living in the United States live with some form of disability. That's roughly 1 in 4. And when I did the research a couple of months ago, that was roughly 61 million people living in the United States. And we have to remember, as we get older, we all become a little bit more disabled, right? Our hearing, our sight can deteriorate over time, but there's also situational disabilities. I recently had a broken arm, and I work in tech for a living, and having that broken arm was really challenging, operating the mouse and using some of the user interfaces. But then we have to think about the people who are on a plane who forgot their headphones and want to utilize closed captioning to watch a video on their mobile device. Or there's the young mother on the bus who's holding her baby in one hand and can't use the whole functionality of her cell phone with the other. There's also medical appointments like LASIK or having your eye drops put in. Even using a smartphone or tablet in the bright sun. And then we really need to remember that not every disability can be seen. There's debilitating pain, there's dizziness, fatigue, brain injuries, learning differences, and mental health disorders, as well as hearing and vision impairments. So I'm going to give you a couple of statistics. WebAIM ran an automated testing survey in 2016 from 62 large universities, and that included 1 from each United States state and territory, to search for common accessibility errors. And they found that 78% of pages had obvious problems. And that's not talking about the little problems we wouldn't necessarily see as able-bodied users. By 2018, that figure had decreased by 10%, but that still leaves a huge amount of improvement. Again, why do we design for accessibility? It's the law. You know, as a nonprofit higher education institution that receives federal funds, you're required to comply with Section 508. And I'll get into what Section 508 is in the terms and definitions section. Being accessible means everyone can readily access what you're offering. That includes services and venues and written content. And inclusion doesn't mean giving special privileges to people. It means that we're sure that those barriers are removed. So who are you? Your project managers, your product owners, your stakeholders, you work in sales, your bloggers, your marketers, you drive social media trends. We're all communicators, and it's everyone's job to make sure that we're inclusive. And since this is the first time I've spoken with this group, I want to take the time to go through some of those terms and definitions. There's the ADA, which is the American with Disabilities Act. That prohibits discrimination and guarantees that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else to participate in mainstream American life, to enjoy employment opportunities, to purchase goods and services, and participate in state and local government programs and services. Section 508, which higher educations are bound by law to abide by, requires federal agencies to develop, procure, maintain, and use information and communications technology that is accessible to people who live with disabilities, regardless of whether or not they work for the federal government. And to be 508 compliant means to be WCAG, WCAG 2.0 compliant. And I'll talk about WCAG in a minute. POUR, P-O-U-R, is an acronym for 4 high-level principles that describe functional accessibility. The first one's perceivable. It means that the user can identify content in user interface elements by means of the senses. So information and user interface components must be presentable to users in a way they can perceive. Operable means that a user can successfully use controls, buttons, navigation, and other necessary elements. So user interface components and navigations must be operable. So we want to be sure to make our functionality available from a keyboard. We want to give users enough time to read and use content. We want to make sure that the content doesn't cause seizures or other physical reactions. And we want to help users navigate and find content. And we want to be sure to make it easier to use in inputs other than the keyboard. So understandable. Information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable. So we make our text readable and understandable. We make content appear and operate in predictable ways. And we also want to help users avoid and correct mistakes by having our pages be more understandable. Robust. That means that users should be able to choose the technology they use to interact with websites, PDFs, documents, multimedia, and any other formats used to convey information. The content must be robust enough that it can be used by a wider array of user agencies, including assistive technology. And we want to make sure that our tools maximize compatibility with current tools as well as future user tools, because we're always adapting, and accessibility really is a moving target. So that's POUR, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And WCAG, that is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And it's really developed with the goal of providing a single shared standard for web content accessibility that meets the needs of not only individuals, but organizations and governments internationally and nationally. And so level A is the minimum level of compliance, followed by AA and AAA. So if you're AA compliant, you're also A compliant. And if you're AAA compliant, you're AA and A compliant. And most universities and higher ed strive for the AA level. And WCAG is primarily intended for web content developers, page authors, site designers, folks like that, the people who develop our tools, the people who develop the evaluation tools as well, and then for any other person who really wants a standard for web accessibility, including mobile accessibility. And assistive technology, we hear this a lot. Sometimes it's broken down into AT. And assistive technology is any device, software, or equipment that helps people around challenges so they can learn, communicate, and function better. So these can include screen readers, speech input devices, pointers, keyboards. Those are all examples of assistive technology. And in this day and age, we must remember that a mobile phone can be considered an assistive technology as well. Super important. A mobile phone can be considered an assistive device. So let's break it down. What makes our content accessible? Again, there's those 4 broad parameters. We want to make it easy to see, so we accommodate visual needs. We want to make sure we make it interactive, and we accommodate motor needs. We want to make it easy to hear, so we accommodate auditory needs. And then we want to make it easy to understand, so we accommodate folks' cognitive needs. We want to make sure the experience is as equivalent as possible, regardless of all of those things we can't control. Screen readers. Simply put, screen readers take the text on our screens and devices and convert it into speech. The technology really allows and empowers users who live with low vision, cognitive and learning disabilities to access that information. And it also creates more privacy. When people can access the information themselves, they're no longer bound to have someone else read that information. So it gives them a sense of privacy. It removes that barrier to the internet or digital information. That same study I talked about earlier conducted a survey to determine how and why users use screen readers. And it found that 87, almost 88% of folks use a screen reader because they live with a disability. And of those 88%, 71% exclusively relied on screen reader audio. So 88% use a screen reader because they live with a disability, and 71% of those folks rely on screen reader audio. Screen readers are important. Screen readers users can navigate the websites by tables, lists, buttons, forms, links, and images, and they have rotors set up to help them follow along on web pages. Developers who want to know how the content sounds on screen readers should really work with native screen readers on a regular basis, or else really learn how to use the screen reader themselves. But as developers and designers and sighted folks, we take shortcuts. So I'm going to stress again that we should really work with native screen readers on a regular basis. So on a web page, we want to make sure there's landmarks and page regions, and that we're using appropriate HTML5, which is semantic, or we're using ARIA landmarks. We want to allow users to skip over repetitive links like mega menus and that sort of thing. We want to have links and form controls that make sense when they're read out of context. And I'm going to go over these again. Images. Why do we love images? Well, first, images enhance our content, especially for people who live with cognitive or learning disabilities. We might include images and media to support or add to our information and concepts. People who live with low vision sometimes use images as cues to help orientate themselves on the page. And media, like our social media, Twitter and LinkedIn, including images really helps with conversions. Having images on our posts lead to a higher click-through rate, or ROI, which is return on our investment. But images can be a major barrier when they're not accessible. So if we think about all the images and the accessible images and who they benefit people using screen readers because there's text alternative that can be read aloud or rendered as Braille. There's folks that use speech input software. They can put the focus onto a button or linked image with a single voice command. Text alternatives can be read out loud for people who are browsing using speech-enabled websites. Mobile web users, images can be turned off, especially for folks that don't have a lot of data or that have poor internet connections. And then accessible images are really good for our SEO, our search engine optimizations, because now that the image is in text, they become indexable. So they're really good for SEO. So there's a lot of different image types, but I'm just going to go through a handful of them. For each image in your web page or digital document, we want to determine the following categories, how they best describe your image. There's the simple image that conveys simple information, like a photograph or an icon or a logo. There's those complex images that convey lots of information. They can be charts or graphs. There's decorative images. And I have some bonus words to say about decorative images later on in the program here, but the image is purely decorative and not informative. There are images of text where the images are displayed and they're intended to be read. There's group of images where the text alternative for one image should convey the information for the whole group. And there's image maps. Image maps contain multiple clickable areas, and we're going to go through all of them. So there's that simple image, images that convey simple information. They should really be described with an alternative text. Lots of times you'll hear people say alt text. Alt text is short, sweet description of the content, and it's typically invisible to people who can see the image, but it's exposed to those who are using assistive technologies like Braille readers or screen readers. And that description should contain the content of the image as concisely as possible, without adding a whole ton of details. For folks who can't necessarily see this image, this is a complex image. It's a very detailed chart with lots of arrows and lines and words. So these can include graphs, charts, diagrams, really too much information that can be effectively described using that alt text we talked about in the last slide. Instead, these images must be described with the long description. And a long description is a more detailed description that provides equivalent access to the information on the page. So we have to ask ourselves as designers and content editors, given the current context, what information is the image trying to convey? What's the intended communication? Because that same information should be provided to people who can't see the image. So a long description can include any structure necessary to communicate the content of the image, and that can include headings, lists, data tables, how you would label a table or a graph. Decorative images, this is a picture of some cubes and triangles. If an image is purely decorative and does not convey meaning, there are a few different ways to tell screen readers to ignore the image. Some images that can be decorative might be borders for styling, some spacers and corners, illustrative text but not contributing information, or they're identified and described by the text around it. If we use alt text in decorative images, the text should help convey the mood or experience of the site of the screen readers, because I feel, and I'm going to iterate this, that if it evokes emotion and that's what you're trying to convey, you're really robbing some folks of that experience when there's no alt text. So if you have an image of a beautiful, peaceful lake and you're talking about relaxation, and that lake really adds to that point, please describe it for folks. There's images of text. That's where readable text is presented within an image. But if the image isn't a logo, we should probably avoid text in images. But if it can't be avoided, the text alternative should contain the same words as in the image. That goes into saying that actual text is much more flexible than images, because when people use zoom functions or up their browser sizes, images can sometimes lose their clarity. They can become pixelated. So we want to make sure that when images become distorted or zoomed in, that we provide that same experience with the alt text. And again, the alt text should contain the same text as the image. Groups of images. So if the multiple image conveys a single piece of information, the text alternative for one image should convey the information for the whole group. And a lot of this is star ratings. You can see there's a picture here of star ratings. I'm going to describe something a little bit different than this, but say the group of 5 images contains a product rating, and there's 5 images. There's 4 filled in stars and 1 half filled star and 1 empty star. Then the text alternative for the first image should read 3.5 out of 5 stars. And then the rest of the images should have that null attribute, you know, where you type the quote, quote in the alt field. Image maps contain multiple clickable areas. This can include park maps, decision trees, Google Maps, organizational charts. And the text alternative for this image should really contain, it should provide overall context for the whole set of links. So each individual clickable area should have an alternate text that describes the purpose or destination of the link, especially in maps. So you can see this map of the Presidio. When you hover over it, it gives a description of Presidio of San Francisco, but then it also gives you a descriptive field of where that link is taking us. And remember, images can be used for links. They can be pagination, our little arrow buttons. They can be anchor links. Images can be logos or decorative. But images can improve the usability by making orientation and interaction elements easier to recognize and use. But we do want to be careful when creating alt attributes for image links, because the alt attribute really has two requirements, and I'm going to repeat it. It must describe the image, and it must tell the user what activating the link will do. So again, when using alt attributes for image links, it has two requirements: describing the image and telling the user what the activating link will do. And context is super important when we talk about alternative do's and don'ts. We want to be accurate and equivalent in presenting the same content and function of the image, but we also want to be succinct and to the point. Typically, no more than a few words are necessary, although in certain circumstances, a short sentence or two could be appropriate. And then we want to make sure that we don't use phrases of image of or graphic of to describe the image, because it's already apparent to the user that's using assistive technology that they're on an image, and a screen reader will announce it as an image anyway. So you'll have redundant, it'll say image of a park. So be very mindful of using phrases like image of and graphic of. We don't want to be redundant and provide the same information as the surrounding text. So to put it really clear, if you turn off the images in your browser, can folks still be able to relay all of your information? Can you turn off your CSS and JavaScript and come up with the same results? Slideshows. I have a little thing on here. It says the first rule of slideshows is not to use slideshows. But lots of times slideshows are predominantly located in our interfaces, and they're used to provide navigation or show page content. Slideshows can display a few items one at a time. They're also known as carousels or sliders. And some common ways of using slideshow include tickers or scrolling news headlines. Sometimes there are featured articles that we have featured on our home pages. They're image galleries. But according to W3 Schools, slideshows are disputed from a usability perspective as well, because even for, abled users, their content is hard to discover. So ensuring accessibility can also improve usability. Again, accessibility can also improve usability for a slideshow. So how do we make our slideshows accessible? Excuse me, I have to cough, so I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, so how do we make our slideshows more accessible? We style the carousel to make sure it's usable. If we use transitions, we want to make sure that the users can stop and resume the transitions or the controls. We want to provide the ability to turn the slideshow or player off. We want to provide visual controls that are accessible to not only the mouse, but to keyboard and touch. And we want to be sure the controls are highlighted on focus. And then if folks can get into your media, you want to make sure that they can get out of your media. So we want to avoid keyboard traps. So back to those controls. Be sure the controls are visible. If you look at this picture, you can see that it's a pretty light gray background, and the controls are pretty light gray as well. So remember size and color and take that into account. And take into account that the background is always changing as well. So make sure you have sufficient color contrast. Size and color are super important. And most universities also will provide a digital color palette that you can reference. So perhaps access your Roosevelt style guides and style sheets. And we want to make sure that there's a reasonable alternative to the slideshow. The slides don't need to function with style sheets or CSS turned off, but the content still needs to be available. So again, like images, can you turn off the slideshow and images and still be able to relay all of your information? Can CSS and JavaScript be turned off with the same results? So let's look at videos. And there's a couple of things to think about. How you're consuming video, and then how your audience is consuming video. Captions. Captions are text versions of the audio content, and generally they're synchronized with the video. And there's many situations that benefit from captions. There's loud environments like airports or a noisy co-working space where you can't hear what's going on in the audio. There's silent environments like that quiet co-working space where you can't turn on the sound. And sometimes content can just be better understood by people hearing and seeing the information. For example, people who are not native speakers of the language. For folks, sometimes it's easier and quicker to read through transcripts and captions rather than watch the videos. And content in text form, such as captions and transcriptions, can also be better indexed by your search engines. So it's good for SEO to have captions. Content can also be downloaded and saved, say if you're on a mobile device. And then YouTube and like Google Slides, we want to make sure that our captions are accurate. I like to call YouTube and Google Slide captions craptioning, which might not be an okay word in all circumstances, but being accurate on your captions is super important. It's not only a good idea, but it's required by a lot of higher ed policies. And captions should include other audio content too, like dogs barking or music playing, anything that adds value to the information. And then captions can either be opened or closed, because we often hear of closed captioning, but some people don't understand that there's an open captioning function as well. Closed captions can be turned on or off, whereas open captions are always visible. Open captions allows for more control over caption location, size, color, and font. But closed captioning is really the most common, utilizing the functionality within most of our media players and video players and browsers. And they appear on top or immediately below the video area. Audio descriptions, those are separate narrative audio tracks that describe important visual content, making it accessible to people who are unable to see the video. So if the visual content is being conveyed through audio, there's no need for audio descriptions. Transcripts, those are basically text versions of the media content. Saying that, a transcript should really capture all of the spoken audio plus any on-screen text or descriptions of any key information that you wouldn't otherwise have access to without seeing the video. Transcripts can provide an important part of making the web multimedia content accessible. They allow people that can't access the content from web audio or video to read a text transcript instead. They don't have to be word for word, but they should contain additional information that really describes and explains and can be beneficial, like laughter or explosions or feet clapping, anything that adds value. Transcripts can also allow users of assistive technology to use refreshable Braille and other devices. And then the users of screen readers often prefer transcripts because they can read at a much higher rate than the video plays, which allows them to get to the content quicker. And again, back to our search engine optimization, they also allow our content to be indexed now. Media players. Choosing an accessible media player can be complicated. We have to think about a bunch of different things when we look at what media player we'd like. Does the media player support closed captions? Are they supported? Can the user toggle the narrative on and off? Does it support audio description in a way that enables those users to toggle the narration on and off? Can the media player's buttons and controls be operated without a mouse? Are the media player's buttons and controls properly labeled so they can be operated by a blind person using a screen reader? Can the media player work across all of your platforms and all the major browsers? So does it include accessibility features for Internet Explorer as well as Firefox or Chrome? And if possible, we really want to allow users to use media at their own pace. Elements should not be subject to a time limit. If you need a time limit to be in place, like say for security reasons, the user should really have the option to turn off or extend that. Unfortunately, sometimes we can't restrict that. So the restriction doesn't necessarily apply if the time limit is due to a live event, like an auction or a game, or if the time to complete the form is essential for valid submission. And I have to say, from a usability perspective, for me, this is really important because I'm a concert fanatic. I love going to concerts and I love getting seats in the front. And so I wait a long time and I wait to push the button and I get my good seats. And I go through the form and it's blinking, the time running out, and I'm just about there, but oh my gosh, I don't have my wallet and I have to run all the way upstairs and dodge kids and bullets and dogs to get to my wallet and hope that I come down in time enough to enter my credit card information. So from a usability perspective, please be respectful of people's time. And in higher ed, we know that our consumer market is very different from other networks. Our consumers are really connected through social media. A few years back, WebAIM conducted a survey of screen readers. They found that 88% use a screen reader on a mobile phone, mobile handheld device, or tablet. And only 54% of those folks found social media somewhat accessible. So 88% of screen reader users use a reader on a mobile device, and only half of the social media could they access. In 2019, almost 200 colleges faced federal civil rights queries on whether their social media was accessible and could clearly communicate to people who live with disabilities. The director of WebAIM said in an article, and I'm going to quote, "This social media thing isn't accessible, but colleges make the decision to use it, and that's their responsibility." courts are saying they need to procure digital goods and services that are accessible for everybody. So let's take a look at hashtags, images, and links. When we use hashtags, we want to be sure that we use capital letters to break up the words in our hashtags. And this comes down to readability. Remember, Twitter doesn't distinguish between cases when we do searches. For example, up on the slide, I have I love Twitter written in two ways. One being the title camel case where I, L, and T are capitalized in I love Twitter, and one where it's all lowercase. When we search, when we type both of those into the search, we'll come up with the same results. But having said that, if your hashtag is just one word or pretty short, then all lowercase is definitely more acceptable. Images in social media should be captioned or described as well. And many of the social media platforms on applications and on desktop versions have settings that allow users to do this. Unfortunately, they're not on by default and you have to dig, but there are accessibility features. Links should be described as well as given some context. And of course, be mindful of retweeting information that's not accessible. So here's an example of a hashtag. So this was a few years ago. It circulated around the internet, and folks like me were like, what, Cher is dead? Because I read that as now that Cher is dead. But what they were really trying to say is that Margaret Thatcher had died. So not having capitalization in that hashtag caused lots of confusion. In social media, I'm not a fan of emoticons, but you know who loves emoticons? Screen readers. And screen readers will read all of them. And this can be cumbersome. And depending on your content, some consumers can find it offensive. And remember that this includes emoticons we place next to our handles, in our Slack names, in subject lines of our emails, and in tweets. So now what? Communication is often the solution for many of our problems. Communication, we want to utilize everyone's skill set with accessibility. So we set up style guides and style sheets, and we use our college's pattern libraries. We want to make sure that our WYSIWYGs, what you see is what you get, our text editors, have tooltips and everyone is trained on how to use them. We want to make sure that we use accessible fonts and color contrast. And we also really need to keep in mind that accessibility is a moving target. Just because our site is compliant today doesn't mean that it will be compliant tomorrow, especially when content is added. And I have another presentation that I give on accessible content, and I try to explain to folks, all the accessible code and all the accessible design in the world doesn't do anything if our content breaks our site as well. Faye is our WordPress engineer over at Canopy, and she's just a kick in the pants. And she said to me one time that accessibility can be a juggling act of priorities when you start incorporating third-party plugins, embedded code, and all that kind of stuff. And that if you really want to have that like live chat function on your site, you might have to build it from scratch to make it accessible to everyone. And that includes some of those widgets that we see on sites that our partners include for us. So we just have to be mindful of our priorities and remember that accessibility is a moving target. So how do we test for accessibility without like having a lot of like pay for services? And there's so many tools, and I'm only going to list a couple of them because I'm going to do a little demo where I just show a couple of the couple that I share. There's Siteimprove. Some of us may know this as a pay for service where we run a crawler through our site to test for accessibility. And there are some caveats to having that automated testing, because automated testing only captures about 30% of our accessibility errors on our site. But Siteimprove has made a browser extension that's really easy to use, and I'm going to give a demo of that. There's the Totally browser extension, that's TOTA11Y, where ally is a numerum, where you have the first and the last letter of your word and replaced with how many letters are in between. So accessibility is 13 letters long, so we replace the words in the middle with the letters in the middle with the number 11. The Totally browser extension. There's keyboard testing. There's the Wave tool. There's the Axe tool from DeQ. There's Lighthouse, which is now built into some of our Chrome developer tools. And there's color contrast analyzers. Okay, so I'm going to escape from here, and I'm going to pull in some websites. I'm not a Starbucks fan because I don't like their espresso, and I'm an iced Americano fan, but I like their website. So one of the things that I had mentioned was keyboard accessibility and visible on focus. And then another thing I mentioned was for users to be able to skip content. So Starbucks does a really great job with this. So I'm just going to hit tab a few times, and you can see up here the first time I hit tab, a skip to main content section appeared. Roosevelt College has some Drupal sites. Fortunately, this is built in by default, where there's a skip to main content link by default, and you have to purposely turn that off in Drupal. So there's the skip to main content, and as I hit the tab key, we can see that I can see where I am on the page. It's highlighted on focus, so it's going through the links, going through. I'm going to refresh this page. And I'm going to go to geocaching.com. This is my favorite game to play. It gets you outside, you find puzzles and caches all around the world. But as I hit tab key, and I'm hitting the tab key, you can't see where I am. All of a sudden, okay, you can see that this is highlighted on focus. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of focus going on. Going back to Starbucks, I'm going to turn on the Siteimprove extension tool. And this is great. So Siteimprove, when you run it as a crawler, is fantastic. It shows you the errors. But again, it only catches 30% of those errors because of the way it's programmed. But the Siteimprove browser extension, what it will do is it will tell you what to check for manually with this eyeball. So at the A level, this non-text content, there's 9 occurrences. Does the ARIA label attribute accurately describe the element? And if you click on this, it will tell you all the places where you should check visually because there's this eyeball, right? We'll look at a couple more of these. So here's an error that the heading is missing text. There's a heading here, which will be searchable by a screen reader, but there's no text behind it. And it's definitely an error. But again, it also gives you the things to manually review. And those don't show up in the crawler. It tells you where your color contrast is insufficient for the element, and it'll tell you where it is. If you open your browser tool and hit inspect, it will highlight the code snippet for you too and tell you where your error is. I'm going to turn the inspect off. You know, you come down and it asks you, is the tabbing sequence? That's what we went through with the keyboard. So if you go to geocaching, it's very different. So you come in here and look, 85 errors. Well, 85 things that you should check for. There's a timer on this. Does it provide enough time? What's the focus order? It's asking if it's making sense. And then here's that problem that we've faced where the elements weren't highlighted on focus. It tells you the errors right there. Another tool I really like is that Totally tool. I'm going to shut off Siteimprove. So this Totally tool comes with a pair of glasses here in the corner, and you select it and you can look at your headings. You can see that here the headings are out of order, but if they were in order, it would give basically an outline. You can test your color contrast. It just highlights all your color contrasts, and will show them as errors if you're not sure. It will display all your landmarks. So if you're looking for ARIA landmarks, which I don't think this page has because they use basically HTML5, then it also gives you a screen reader one where you can test to see if it's picked up by a screen reader. So that's nice. I'm gonna refresh this page. And then there's the Wave tool. They just did a user interface change, which is super nice. They have where your errors are highlighted, and then you can hit details and it'll tell you where the errors are. So down here. So there's some really great tools available. You just have to look at them. And let's see, color contrast analyzer is one I like to utilize. It's a pretty easy tool for testing color contrast. It might crash the first time I use it because that's just its history. But I can go here and I can select this eyedropper, and it wants the foreground color. So I'm going to hit play, and then it wants the background color, which is that green. Oh, I just did a update, so we might not be able to use that right now. Nope. Okay, sorry about that. I just updated to Catalina, but you can see that if I hit this eyedropper and go over here, it's supposed to, highlight this section. And then if I do the background, and then it will give you whether or not it passes at different levels, depending on your size of text and whether or not you're using it for a graphical user interface or not. And if there's any errors, you can come in here and you can open it up, and then you can, if you're doing an audit, you can, give suggestions to your developers. And then there's zoom tools, where does your site obscure when you're zoomed in? Scale. You can see here that they don't do a good job, that this fails for some, like maybe people who have glaucoma or have really low vision and need their text size bumped up quite a bit. It doesn't scale well. So there's the zoom text tool. I think I'm going to leave it at that because we don't have too much time left. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi, so it's Allison from Canopy. Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. If anyone has a question, please type it in the chat window.
Yeah, feel free to speak. No questions?
And if anybody does have a follow-up question that comes up later on, please do feel free to let me know, and I can pass along the question to AmyJune as well. So if there's something you think of later on, we definitely want to get those questions answered then too.
Yeah, and remember, reach out to Tanya or anybody at that hello@canopy.com address. I have a QR code maybe for LinkedIn. If you want to reach out to me directly, you can like scan that and do the LinkedIn. And also across all of the medias, I'm Volkswagen Chick. Pretty easy to find.
Is the presentation available? Did you say where we could download it, or?
I can do that. I can zip it up into a PDF and give it to Aaron to distribute to folks.
Yeah, and we'll
acronym words and the definitions of what they were.
Yeah, we'll be posting the video along with the presentation if you're willing to share it, AmyJune.
Yep.
We'll post those things on Inside Roosevelt within the next few days. So I think we probably should wrap up. I know people need to get ready to watch the Senate meeting on Zoom. So I think we'll call it a day. Thank you all for joining. As I mentioned, we'll be putting this up on Inside Roosevelt fairly soon, and you can let other people know about it as well if they were not able to attend. So I think that's it. Thank you very much to AmyJune and to Allison from Canopy Studios. Thank you all for attending today, and stay safe and healthy out there.
And thank you. That was a great presentation.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everybody.
All right, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.